New 72 Radio, the voice, views, and visions of the collective.
So welcome to my new class. It's a combining of the voice of Odin and Tales of the Sacred Isles into a mixing of the people of my race. I'm half Saxon, half Celtic, so I can mix all the stories together in hopefully an interesting tale. This first class, I'm going to talk of, can't say a bloody thing with them, I'm sorry about me swearing, about the Welsh people who are sort of halfway on the western extremes of England and Britain, and then the Irish Sea between them and the Emerald Isle. So, and I'm taking, what I'm going to read is from the Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race. So this chapter is called Myths and Tales of the Cymry, and the Cymry is the old name for the Welsh. The absence in early Celtic literature of any world myth or of any philosophic account of the origin and constitution of things was noted at the opening of its third chapter. In Gaelic literature, there is, as far as I know, nothing which even pretends or represents early Celtic thought on the subject. It is otherwise in Wales. Here, there has existed for a considerable time a body of teaching purporting to contain a portion, at any rate, of the ancient Druidic thought, which Caesar Cook tells us was communicated only to the initiated and never written down. So basically it was all word of mouth, and this still existed in Wales, and it would have been in Anglesey, the last stronghold of the Druid culture. This teaching is principally to be found in 2 volumes entitled Barddas, a compilation made from materials in the possession by a Welsh bard and scholar named Llewellyn Sion of Glamorgan, towards the end of the 16th century, and edited with a translation by J.A. Williams, Ap Ithel, of a Welsh MS Society. Modern Celtic scholars pour contempt on the pretentious works like this and enshrined any really antiquarian thought. Thus, Mr. John Ivor B. John, all idea of bardic Stoic doctrine involving pre-Christian mythic philosophy must be utterly disregarded. This is the way that the scholars of the time thought about anything pre-Christian in Britain, that we had no culture, we had no traditions, we had no original thoughts, no art, no music, no poetry, but that was really all proved to be extremely wrong. The nonsense talked upon the subject is largely due to the uncritical invention of pseudo-antiquities of the 16th and 17th century and 18th century. Still, the Bardic order was certainly at one time in possession of such a doctrine. That order had a fairly continuous existence in Wales up to the Cromwell date. And though no critical thinker would build with any confidence a theory of pre-Christian doctrine on a document of the 16th century, it does seem wise to scout altogether the possibility that some fragments of antique lore may have lingered long before Bardic tradition. At any rate, Barddas is a work of considerable philosophic interest, and even if it represents nothing but a certain current of Cymric thought in the 16th century, it is not unworthy of attention by the students of all things Celtic. Purely Druidic it does not even profess to be, but for Christian personages and episodes from Christian history figure largely in it. But we come occasionally upon a strain of thought which, whatever else it may be, is certainly not Christian, and speaks of an independent philosophic system, a bit like what the Greeks had. But how dare we suggest that the Celts had this? In this system, 2 primary existences are complemented, God and Cithraul, who stand representatively at the principle of energy tending towards life, and the principle of destruction tending towards nothingness. Cithraul is realized in Anun. which may be rendered the abyss or chaos. Anun is the underworld. In the beginning, there was nothing but God and Anun. Organized life began with the word. God pronounced his ineffable name, and the Manred was formed. The Manred is a primal substance of the universe. It was conceived as a multitude of minute, indivisible particles, atoms in fact, each being a microcosm, for God is complete in each of them, while at the same time each part of God, the whole, the totality of being as it now exists, is represented by 3 concentric circles. The innermost of them, where life sprang from, Anun, is called Abred. And this is the stage and struggle of the evolution, the constant of life, with Cuthro. The next is the circle of Gwynfryd, of purity, in which life is manifested as pure, rejoicing force, having attained its triumph over evil. The last and outermost circle is called Cuigant, or infinity. Here all predicates Phallus, and this circle represented graphically, not by a bounding line, but by a dissurgent rays. He is inhabited by God alone. The following extract from Bardas, in which he alleged bardic teachings, is conveyed in catechism form, will serve to show the order of ideas in which the writer's mind moved. So bear in mind, this is a translation of the doctrines of the Druids in the 16th century, which was a very Christian influenced time. Question. So it's a question and answer scenario asking about their philosophy. Question. Whence did thou proceed? Answer. I came from the great world, having my beginning in Anun. Question. Where art thou now? And how camest thou to what thou art? I am the little world, whether I came having traversed the circle of Abred, and now am I man, at its termination and its extreme limits. Question. What wert thou before didst become man in the circle of Abred? I was Anun, and least possible that I was capable of life, and the nearest possible of absolute death. I came in every form and every thought, from capable of the body and life to the state of man along the circle of Abred, where my condition was severe and grievous during the ages of ages ever since. I was parted from Anun and the dead by the gift of God and his great generosity and his unlimited endless love. Question. Through how many different forms didst thou come, and what happened unto thee? Answer. Through every form capable of life. I came in water, I came in air, I came in earth. And there happened unto me every severity, every hardship, every evil, and every suffering. But little was the goodness of Gwynfryd before I came a man. Gwynfryd cannot be obtained without seeing and knowing everything, but it is not possible to see or to know everything without suffering everything. And there can be no full and no perfect love that does not produce these things which are necessary to lead to the knowledge that causes Gwynfryd. Every being, we are told, shall attain to the circle of Gwynfryd at last. There is much here that reminds us of Gnostic and Oriental thought. It is certainly very unlike Christian orthodoxy of the 16th century, as a product of the Cymric mind that the period of the reader may take for what it's worth, without troubling himself either with antiquarian theories or their refutations. Let us now turn to the really ancient work, which is not philosophic but creative and imaginative, produced by British bards and fabulists of the Middle Ages. But before we go to set forth what we shall find in the literature, we must delay a moment to discuss one thing, which we shall not. The Arthurian sagas. For the modern majority of readers who have not made any special study of the subject, the mention of early British legend will inevitably call up the glories of the Arthurian saga. They will think of the fabled palace at Caerleon on Usk, the Knights of the Round Table, riding forth on chivalrous adventure, the quest for the Grail, the guilty love of Lancelot, flower of knighthood for the Queen, the last great battle of the Northern Sea, the voyage of Arthur, sorely wounded but immortal, to the mystic valley of Avalon. But as a matter of fact, they will find in the native literature of medieval Wales, little or nothing like this exists. No Round Table, no Lancelot, no Grail quest, no Isle of Avalon, until the Welsh learned about them from abroad. And though there was indeed an Arthur in this literature, he is a wholly different being from the Arthur of what now we call the Arthurian sagas. The earliest extent mentioned of Arthur is found in the work of the British historian Nennius, who wrote his Historia Britanniarum about the year 800. He derives his authority from the various sources, ancient monuments and writings of Britain and Ireland. In connection with the latter country, he records the legends of Partholon, Roman annals and chronicles of saints, especially Sir Germanus. He presents a fantastically Romanized and Christianized view of British history, deriving the Britons from a Trojan and Roman ancestry. His account of Arthur, however, is both sober and brief. Arthur, who according to Nennius lived in the 6th century, was not a king. His ancestry was less noble than that of many other British chiefs, who nevertheless, for his great talents as a military imperialist, or Dux Bellorum, chose him to be the leader against the Saxons, whom he defeated in 12 battles, the last being at Mount Badon. Arthur's office was doubtless a relic of Roman military organization, and there's no reason to doubt his historical existence. However, impenetrable may be the veil which now obscures his valiance and often triumphant battlings for order and civilization in our disastrous age. Next, we have Geoffrey of Monmouth, Bishop of St. Asaph, who wrote his Historia Regum Britanniae in South Wales in the early part of the 12th century. This work is an audacious attempt to make sober history out of a mass of mythical and legendary matter, mainly derived, if we are to believe the author, from an ancient book brought from his uncle, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, from Brittany. The mention of Brittany in this connection is, as we shall say, very significant. Geoffrey, who expressly, to commemorate the exploits of Arthur, who now appears as a king, son of Uther Pendragon and Igerna, wife of Galaus, Duke of Cornwall, to whom Uther gained access in the shape of her husband through the magic arts of Merlin, he places the beginning of Arthur's reign in the year 505. He recounts the wars against the Saxons and says he ultimately conquered not only all Britain but Ireland, Norway, Gaul, and Dacia, and successfully resisted a demand for tribute and homage from the Romans. He held his court at Caerleon on Usk, while he was away on the continent carrying on his struggle with Rome. His nephew Mordred usurped his crown and wedded his wife Gunharmura. Arthur, on this return, and after defeating the traitor at Winchester, slew him in the last battle in Cornwall, where Arthur himself was sorely wounded, AD 542. The Queen retired to a convent in Caerleon. Before her, the dead Arthur conferred his kingdom to his kinsman, Constantine, and was then carried off mysteriously to the Isle of Avalon to be cured, and the rest is silent, and to rest in silence. Arthur's magic sword, the Caliburn, Welsh Caladrich, is mentioned by Geoffrey and described as being made in Avalon, a word which seems to imply some kind of fairyland, a land of the dead, and may be related to the Norse Valhalla. It was not until later times that Avalon came to be identified with an actual site in Britain, Glastonbury. In Geoffrey's narrative, there is nothing about the Holy Grail or Lancelot or the Round Table or an excerpt of the illusion of Avalon. The mystical element of the Arthurian saga is absent. Like Nennius, Geoffrey finds a fantastical classical origin for the Britons. His so-called history is perfectly worthless as a record of fact, but it has proved a veritable mine for poets and chroniclers, and has the distinction of having furnished the subject of the early English tragic drama, Gorboduc, as well as for Shakespeare's King Lear. And its author may be described as the father of at least its quasi-historical side of the Arthurian saga, which he made up partly out of records of a historical Dux Bellorum of Nennius, and partly out of poetical amplifications of these records, made in Brittany by the descendants of exiles from Wales, many of whom fled there at the very time when Arthur was waging his wars against the heathen Saxons. Geoffrey's book had a wonderful success. It was speedily translated into French by Wacky, who wrote Les Romans de Brut about 1155, which added details from Breton sources, and translated Wacky's French into Anglo-Saxon by Layamon, who thus anticipated Malory's adaptations of the late French prose romances. Except a few scholars who protested unavailingly, no one doubted its strict historical truth, and it had the important effect of giving an early British history a new dignity in the estimation of the continent and of other English princes. To sit upon the throne of Arthur was regarded in itself a glory by Plantagenet monarchs, who had not a trace of Arthur or of any British blood. The Breton sources must next be considered. Unfortunately, not a line of ancient Breton literature has ever come down to us. For our knowledge, if we look, must rely on appearances it makes in works of French writers. One of the earliest these is the Anglo-Norman poetess, who called herself Marie de la France and wrote about 1150 and afterwards. She wrote, among other things, a number of lays or tales, which she explicitly and repeatedly tells us were translated or adapted from Breton sources. Sometimes she claims to have rendered the writer's original exactly. Little is actually said about Arthur in any of these tales, but the events of them are placed in his time. In Celtèmes de Tinte Art la Terre and the allusions, which include a mention of the Round Table, evidently imply the general knowledge of the subject among those to whom the Bretons, liés, were addressed. Lancelot is not mentioned, but there is a lay about Lanval, who is beloved of Arthur's queen, but rejects her because he has a fairy mistress in the Isle of Avalon. Gawain is mentioned, and an episode is told in the Lay de Chevreuil about Tristan and Isolde, whose maid, Brangien, is referred to in a way which assumed that the audience knew part of she had played in Isolde's bridal night. In short, we have evidence here of the existence in Brittany of a well-diffused and well-developed body of a chivalric legend gathered about the personality of Arthur. The legends are so well known that the more mere allusions to characters and episodes in them are well understood as references in Tennyson's Idylls will be among to us today. The Lay of Marie de France therefore points strongly to Brittany as the true cradle of Arthurian saga on its chivalrous and romantic side. They do not, however, mention the Grail. Lastly and chiefly, we have the work of the French poet Chrestien de Troyes, who began in 1165 to translate Breton lays like Marie de France, and who practically brought the Arthurian saga into the poetic literature of Europe and gave it its main outline and character. He wrote a Tristan, now lost. He, if not Walter Map, introduced Lancelot of the Lake into the story. He wrote a Conte del Graal, in which the Grail legend and Percival made their first appearance, though he left the story unfinished and does not tell us what the Grail really was. He also wrote a long Conte d'Aventure entitled Eric, containing the story of Geraint and Enid. These are the earliest poems we possess in which Arthur of chivalric legend comes prominently forward. What were the sources of Chrestien? No doubt they were largely Breton. Troyes is in Champagne, which has been united with Blois in 1019, but Eudes, Count de Blois, and reunited again after his period of disposition by Count Theobald de Blois in 1128. Marie, Countess of Champagne, was Chrestien's patroness, and there were close connections between the ruling princes of Blois and Brittany. Alain II, the Duke of Brittany, had in the 10th century married a sister of the Count of Blois, and in the first quarter of the 13th century, Jean I of Brittany married Blanche de Champagne, while their daughter Alix married Jean de Castillon, Count of Blois, in 1254. It is highly probable, therefore, that through minstrels who attended the Breton lords at their courts de Blois from the middle of the 10th century onwards, a great many Breton tales and legends found their way into French literature during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. But it is also certain that the Breton legends themselves have been strongly affected by French influences, and that to the Matadere de France, as it is called by medieval writers, i.e. the legends of Charlemagne and his paladins, we owe the Round Table and the chivalric institutions ascribed to Arthur's court at Caerleon and Usk. It must now be forgotten that, as Miss Jessie L. Weston has emphasised in her invaluable studies on the Arthurian saga, Gaultier de Dain, the earliest of the contributors or reworkers of Christian de Troyes, mentions as his authority the stories of Gawain I Belleris, a poet born and bred in Wales. This forgotten bard is believed to be identical with the famous Il Fabulateur Bled Hericius, mentioned by Gerardus Cambrenius, and with the Bressis quoted by Thomas of Brittany as an authority on the Tristan story. So you've got a lot of jumping backwards before with French story writers, minstrels, bards who go from town to town, tell the story, it gets changed, they add a bit in. But Gerardus of Cambrenius is a Welsh bard. So he puts some of the original story back into the facts and also mentions with Tristan. In the absence, however, of any information as to where or exactly what Bleheris wrote, the opinion must, I think, hold the field that the Arthurian saga, as we have it now, is not of Welsh, not even of pure Breton origin. The Welsh exiles who colonised part of Brittany about the 6th century must have brought with them many stories of the historical Arthur. They must also have brought legends of the Celtic deity Artius, a god whom altars have been found in France. These personages ultimately blended into one, even as in Ireland the Christian Saint Bridget blended with the pagan goddess Briganta. We thus get a mythical figure combining something of the exaltation of the god with a definite habitation on earth and a place in history. An Arthur saga thus arose, which in its Breton, not Welsh, form is greatly enriched with material drawn in from the legends of Charlemagne and his peers. While both in Brittany and in Wales, it became a centre round which clustered a mass of floating legendary matter relating to various Celtic personages, human and divine. Christian de Troyes, working on Breton material, ultimately gave it the form in which it conquered the world, and in which it became in the 12th and 13th centuries what the Faust legend was in later times, the accepted vehicle for the ideals and aspirations of an epoch. From the continent, and especially from Brittany, the story of Arthur came back into Wales, transformed and glorified. The late Dr. Heinrich Zimmer, in one of his luminous studies of the subject, remarks that in Welsh literature we have definite evidence that the South Welsh prince Rhys ap Tudor, who had been in Brittany, brought from thence in the year 1070 the knowledge of Arthur's Round Table to Wales, where of course it had been hitherto unknown, and many Breton lords are known to have followed the banner of William the Conqueror into England. The introducers of the saga into Wales found, however, a considerable body of Arthurian matter, very different character already in existence there. Besides the traditions of the historical Arthur, the Dux Bellorum of Nennius, there was the Celtic deity, Artius. It is probably a reminiscence of this deity whom we meet with under the name of Arthur in the only genuine Welsh Arthurian story we possess, the story of Cilwch and Olwen in the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion is a very old book where Arthur is first mentioned in the Celtic literature. Much of the Arthurian saga derived from Christian and other continental writers was translated and adapted in Wales as in other European countries, but as a matter of fact it made later and a lesser impression in Wales than most anywhere else. It conflicted with their existing Welsh traditions, both historical and mythological. It was a fall to a matter of entirely foreign to the Welsh spirit, and it remained always in Wales something alien and unassimilated. Into Ireland it never even entered at all. These few introductory remarks do not, of course, profess to contain a discussion on the Arthurian saga, which is a vast subject with a myriad of ramifications historically, mythologically, and mystically, and what not, but merely intended to indicate a relation that the saga of genuine Celtic literature, and to explain why we shall hear so little of it in the following accounts of Cymric myths and legends. It was a great spiritual myth which, arising from the composite source above described, overran a continent, as its hero was supposed to have done, is armed with conquest, but it cannot be regarded as a special possession of the Celtic race, nor is at present exempt in a form of translation adapted from any Celtic tongue. The myths and legends of the Celtic race, which have come down to us in the Welsh language, are in some respects of a different character from those in which we possess in Gaelic. The Welsh material is nothing like as full as the Gaelic, nor so early. The tales of the Mabinogion are mainly drawn from the 14th century manuscript, the Red Book of Hengist. One of them, the Romance of Taliesin, came from another source, a manuscript of the 17th century. The four oldest tales in the Mabinogion are supposed by scholars to have taken their present shape in the 10th and 11th century, while several Irish tales, like the story of Etain and Midir, or the death of Conry, go back to the 17th or 8th centuries. It will be remembered that the story of the invasion of Partholon was known to Nennius, who wrote in the year 800. As one might though expect, the mythological elements in the Welsh romances are usually much more confused and harder to decipher than the early of the Irish tales. The mystic interest has grown less, the story interest greater. The object of the bard is less to hand down a sacred text than to entertain the prince's court. We must remember also that the influence of the continental romances of chivalry is clearly perceivable in the Welsh tales, and in fact comes eventually to govern them completely. In many respects, the Irish Celts anticipated the ideas of these romances, the lofty courtesy shown at each other by enemies, the fantastic pride which forbade a warrior to take advantage of a wounded adversary, the extreme punctilio in which the duties or observations proper to each man's caste or station was observed. All this tone of thought and feeling, which would seem so strange to us, we met in an instant in the classical literature, would seem quite familiar and natural to continental romances of the 12th and later centuries. Centuries earlier than that, it was a marked feature of Gaelic literature, yet in Irish romances, whether Ortonian or Oceanic, the element which has since been considered the most essential motive in the romantic tale is almost entirely lacking. This is the element of love, or rather the woman worship. The continental fabulist felt that he could do nothing without the motive of action, but the love lady, or the lady of love, of the English, French and German knight, whose favour he wore for those grace he endured infinite hardship and peril, does not meet us in any Gaelic literature. It would have seemed absurd to an Irish Celt to make a plot of a serious story hinge on the kind of passion with which the medieval Dulcinea inspired her faithful knight. In the two most famous and popular of the Gaelic love tales, the tale of Deirdre and the pursuit of Dermot and the Grania, the women are the wooers and the men are most reluctant to commit what they know to be the folly of yielding to them. Now this romantic chivalric kind of love, which idolized women into a goddess and made the service of his lady a sacred duty to the knight, though it never reached Wales the height which it did in the continental and English romances, is yet clearly discernible there. We can trace it to Killich and Olwen, which is comparatively an ancient tale. It will well develop in later stories like Pederi and the Lady of the Fountain. It is a symptom of the extent on which the comparison to Irish Welsh literature has lost its pure Celtic strain and become affected. I do not, of course, say it is lost, but it is mainly affected by foreign interests and influences. The oldest of the Welsh tales, those called the four branches of the Mabinogion, are the richest in mythological elements, but these occur in more or less recognizable form throughout early and the medieval tales, and even after many transmutations by Mallory. We can clearly discern certain mythological figures common in all Celtica. We meet, for instance, the personage of Nuth or Ludd, evidently a solar deity. A temple dating from Roman times and dedicated to him under the name of Nodens has been discovered at Lydney by the Severn. On a bronze plaque found near the spot is a representation of the god. He is encircled by a halo and accompanied by flying spirits and by tritons. We're reminded of the Danann deities and their close connection with the sea, and we find that the Welsh legend and epitaph is attached to Nuth, meaning of the silver hand. Though no exact Welsh legend tells the meaning of the epitaph, we have no difficulty in identifying this Nud with Nuada of the Silver Hand, who led the Danans in the Battle of Moytara. Under his name Ludd, he is said to have had a temple on the site of St Paul's in London, the entrance to which, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, was called the British tongue Path Luv, which the Saxons translated Ludesgate, our present day Ludgate, in the city of London. So this is a historical background of all the things I'm going to be talking. The next class will be more, this is the bones we need to understand where a lot of these stories, how they've been influenced. They aren't the original versions which was told in the 5th and 6th century. They are long gone because they were passed from word of mouth, father to son, bard to bard, fire to fire, stories told, and each one's changed. But with the coming of the Normans and the Grail legends and the Arthurian story, all the other stories got this romantic, chivalric edge. So we must discern that when we listen to the stories I read in future. And I will compare. By 1 week I'll read next week I will read a Celtic story, and then the following time I will read a Norse and Saxon and Germanic story, and you'll see how the essence and energy changes between the two. Thank you for giving your time to listen to me today. I hope it wasn't too boring, but I do like to set the scene for the things I'm going to do in future. And bless you all. Thanks for tuning in. I'll speak to you soon.